And to discuss more, we're being joined live by Professor Tilman Ruff. He is the co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and a Nobel Peace laureate. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on the broadcast on WION World is One.
Thanks for having me.
Right, and so let's start by assessing the situation. Now we know that Iran says that it won't come back to the negotiating table while it's under attack. And meanwhile, Israel says that it is going to keep attacking for as long as it takes to achieve its logical conclusion. And meanwhile, President Trump has issued a 2-week ultimatum for Iran. Now, with pressure mounting with each passing day, how long do you think Iran can actually hold out?
Look, it's hard to know militarily. Clearly, Iran was taken by this surprise attack. Their air defences have been largely put out of action, and their retaliation has been much less effective and more limited, and perhaps less well targeted, with many civilian targets being hit of really dubious or no military significance, compared with the Israeli strikes, which have been much more intense and more widely targeted across the very large country that Iran is. But, you know, Iran is a country of 90 million people and, rather heavily militarized, and it has operated both through direct military capacity itself, but also by arming and supporting many surrogate proxies in the region, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas and Hezbollah in Gaza and Lebanon, respectively. So it has a wide network across the region of potentially military forces that might answer its call. So it's difficult to know. I mean, of course, it seems unlikely that Iran now, having said that negotiations are off while they're under attack, and the discussions with the Americans seem to have pretty much ground to a halt. Certainly the negotiations that were underway and really progressing as far as one could tell about Iran's nuclear program, that this attack by Israel seems intended to derail. Those are now clearly suspended. Back channels are certainly opening. One hears particularly through the European Union and Arab states. But, Iran is taking a punishing, of course, not just the government and military and civilian leaders and infrastructure, but also the nuclear facilities across the country, and also residential districts have been targeted, and many of the energy infrastructure that Israel has targeted, for example, large oil depots, have caused major explosions and fires that have of course damaged civilians, given the size of Tehran and the fact that there are many industrial and military facilities that are within the city. Also, it's hard to discern the military value of some of the targets that have been hit, like Iranian state television. I mean, I fail to see any useful or legitimate military purpose. This potentially could be an important way for Iranians to learn how to protect themselves and potentially where to go if areas become unsafe. So that seems to me to be really beyond the laws of war. Israel seems very determined. They certainly, while they have support, financial and military supplies from the United States and Germany and other European nations in particular, despite fighting wars on multiple fronts now, not just in Gaza, and attacking also sites in Lebanon, but also having attacked sites in Yemen a couple of days ago, clearly has the capacity to operate on multiple fronts. So this could go for a long time, but it's hard to see a fairly fundamentalist regime that has always portrayed Israel as the mortal enemy, stopping, surrendering in a sense anytime soon.
Right, Professor Ruff, and now we also know that Israel says that its strikes have pushed Iran's nuclear timeline by 2 to 3 years. But while having said that, this is amid speculations that the strategy might backfire, and instead of deterring Tehran, it could actually harden its resolve and actually accelerate its push towards a nuclear weapon. What's your assessment on that?
I think that's a very real concern. I think the first thing to say is that these attacks are illegal. There was no evidence that Iran posed an imminent threat to Israel. And attacks on nuclear facilities are prohibited under international law and by many different international instruments. They pose very significant risks to civilians of releasing dangerous radioactive materials that can spread indiscriminately and affect countries beyond the one that's targeted. So this is an extremely dangerous practice, and also the idea that one nation, and by the way, the only nation to possess nuclear weapons, is justified to control what it observes, what it regards as proliferation behaviour in Iran leading towards nuclear proliferation. This is so non-proliferation, essentially by a unilateral military attack, is completely illegal under international law. This is not a sustainable path to control nuclear weapons. There's no evidence from either US intelligence communities, from the International Atomic Energy Agencies, which until these attacks had inspectors constantly in the country, that Iran has a nuclear weapons program at present. It's likely to have had an early nuclear weapons program more than 20 years ago, but there's absolutely no evidence now that that's the case. The problem, of course, with nuclear capacity is that if you can enrich uranium to run a nuclear reactor, whether it's for nuclear power or research, or you can enrich uranium to do that, or you have those reactors, then you can acquire the material to build nuclear weapons from, and any determined state can do so. So we already know that Iran has at least one facility in Fordo that's very deeply buried, at least 800 metres or so underground, beyond the reach perhaps of all conventional weapons, and certainly any weapons short of ones that the Americans have, their largest bombs. And if those targets are not already immune from anything but nuclear attack, then it's certainly possible for Iran to move fissile materials around to construct new facilities. It's impossible really to achieve disarmament and non-proliferation by bombing. And it's just as likely that the outcome might be a regime that's even more determined, or that now does actually decide to build nuclear weapons as the only way to ensure that it's not the victim of Israeli unilateral aggression and potentially Israeli nuclear weapons. So yes, I think that concern that this might actually drive proliferation rather than stop it is a very real and warranted one.
Absolutely, Professor Ruff. And in the latest, a senior IRGC commander has suggested that key nuclear assets in Iran have already been relocated by now. And now with that being said, a lot of US-based think tanks like the ISW and the CPT, they say that the Islamic Republic may be deliberately invoking this spectre of a long and possibly futile hunt for nuclear material. Now, do you think that's a tactic for Iran to actually get some diplomatic leverage when it comes back to the negotiating table with this, I want to say, calculated ambiguity that it has created?
Look, it may be. One would imagine that they will want to be in the strongest possible negotiating position. I mean, this conflict has to can really only end in one of two ways, either by a complete destruction of Iran and surrender, which for a nation of 90 million people with a very large military and 5 million armed forces is hard to foresee. Or negotiations. So the sooner negotiations can happen, the better. And Iran certainly hasn't closed the door to negotiations entirely, and may well look for ways to strengthen its hand, given that clearly it has been decimated both militarily, politically, and I think in terms of its nuclear program by the surprise and militarily quite effective Israeli attack.
Right, Professor Ruff, and
it's certainly possible, just to add, it's certainly possible to move nuclear materials around. Some of the facilities would be very difficult to construct in the short term, for example, the centrifuges. While the IAEA was still able to verify, there was certainly evidence that the major centrifuge facility at Natanz was quite severely affected in the first wave of Israeli attacks, including some of the underground centrifuges. Those are very delicate and complicated structures that require very sophisticated engineering. It's not likely that they can be readily moved. But fissile material itself, the enriched uranium, the more than 400 kilograms of more than 60% enriched uranium that Iran now has,
of course,
that could certainly be readily moved.
Like to get in more details about that, but we have another interesting development about which we'd like to get your take on.